being able to ritualize grief is a way that helps our brain integrate that into our everyday life. And that is what helps us become more resilient. And that is something that, yes, it's great if an organization can do it on their own, but that's something that we ourselves can cultivate. If that means that you take a minute to touch the door of the enclosure and say, like, you know, I loved this animal. I shared so many good moments with this animal. And just like maybe every time you walk into that enclosure, you touch that door as a reminder of like, hey, I remember the last animal that was in here and how much I loved this animal.
Welcome to the episode of Animals, Nature, and You. I'm your host, Rick Schwartz. And as always, I am very glad you're here, but I do need to give you a little bit of a disclaimer. This conversation we're going to have today is going to talk about loss. We're going to talk about grief, which also includes death. We will talk about loss of loved ones and also loss of animals in our care as animal care specialists, wildlife care specialists, zookeepers, all of that. The thing is, Animals, Nature, and You, this particular episode is about you. It's about the human side of it. You cannot live without experiencing grief. And I can say I went many years with minimal experience of grief compared to where I am now in life. And before this podcast was even thought of as an idea, I was going through several years where there was compounded grief, where different things happened, that it was a series of losses that occurred. And getting out in nature, spending time with animals and recognizing the value of that helped me tremendously. So when I got to the point of creating this podcast as an idea, as many of you have heard, if you've heard earlier episodes where I talked about how this came about, Animals, Nature, and You, it is about the connectivity that we have with the world around us and with each other. That's why it's you and not humans, because it is more personal to say you. Animals, Nature, and You exist because we are all connected. This conversation today is going to be very important because it is a topic, I think, in the animal care world we aren't versed in well enough for the fact that it is a big part of our life. I think is important and valuable for us to, as we grow through life and we experience loss and change. And I had a preliminary phone call with this guest, and right away I'm like, okay, this is clearly going to be a two-part episode. This is going to be a long conversation. So this is part one today that we're going to have for you. So I'm going to bring our guest into the studio just so we can get into this conversation, because it's going to be a great one. She is a former dolphin trainer turned human coach. Her name is Brigid Dodge. She supports working professionals standing at the intersection of change, loss, and grief. Drawing from her evidence-based research and her own personal experiences, Brigid helps people navigate the new seasons of life that follow moments of upheaval, be it a divorce or the loss of a job, the diagnosis no one ever wants, or even death or something else entirely. She works one-on-one with clients in addition to facilitating her own signature group course, the Death Card Collective, which teaches people how to process loss, embrace change, and cultivate hope using the natural world as her guide. So with that, Brigid, I look forward to this conversation. It's going to be great. Thank you so much for taking the time to be a guest here on Animals, Nature, and You.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Rick. I'm really excited about this conversation, which might seem counterintuitive given the subject, but, you know, I don't think that's something that we as humans talk about enough.
Well, yes, that. And I think within the outside bubble, outside of the bubble of the animal care world, the animal training world, conservation, wildlife, there's perhaps this view that everything's shiny and roses because you spend all day playing with animals. And there's a lot more to that. And I think that discussion needs to happen not only for the sake of the people in the business of caring for animals and wildlife, but those looking to get into it also. And I want to talk to you as we get further into it too about the culture that I grew up with, if you will, and by growing up in the animal care world, how grief was almost shunned and and how we're realizing that that was the wrong path. But before we get into all of that, it was mentioned in the intro that you started off in dolphin training and have morphed now into doing the grief coaching. Let's start at the beginning. How did you get into dolphin training? What were you doing? What was that like for you to start your journey there?
Yeah. Well, I think, my journey starts like many other journeys do, where, you're in second grade and you go to the zoo or you go to an aquarium and you're just in awe. For me in particular, I grew up in landlocked Colorado. So the ocean always fascinated me. And I remember that very first trip to see ocean animals, and just like that was it. I had decided this was the same time that the Free Willy movie had come out. I had the pendant. I wore the pendant every day. It came in the VHS box. I might be dating myself with that reference.
I mean, the term VHS, just so anybody doesn't know, we used to watch movies on these giant cassettes, these plastic boxes that would go into another plastic box. So anyhow.
Yeah. You had to physically rewind it. Sometimes you forgot, and then your whole world collapsed when you wanted to start your movie.
Yeah.
But all that aside, I knew from a young age that that's what I wanted to do. And it wasn't until I got into college that I started to actually research. What does it take? Okay, it takes getting a degree in psychology. I was lucky enough that my college offered an emphasis in animal behavior. So my lab work was in animal behavior. I did, both. I did a qualitative study at the San Diego Zoo and did lab work with like zebrafish and, things like that. And then the next path is to do internships. So my first internship was with the Navy Marine Mammal Program in San Diego. And then from there, I did an internship at Sea Life Park in Hawaii, Oahu. And that turned into my first full-time position. So that's how it all started. And I think that, as many of us know, when you work with animals, particularly various species of animals, most of them don't have the same lifespan as humans. And it will inevitably come about that you will say goodbye to some of those animals. And at many of the facilities that I worked, we had a fairly geriatric populations sometimes. And so that became part of the responsibility of the job, is not only caring for the animals while they were with us, but also making sure that we saw them out of this world in a way that was, as compassionate as possible. And so then, while I was at my first position, I actually lost my father very unexpectedly, very suddenly. And so my worlds kind of collided. Like I had been used to kind of saying goodbye to animals, but this was a first moment where I said goodbye to a member of my own family, other than a grandparent, a pet, those kind of first instances of loss where we don't really have an understanding of it. We haven't quite conceptualized it yet, depending on where we are developmentally at the age that happened. But I remember just kind of being inundated with these feelings of loss and not knowing where to put them. So I ended up, like a lot of people do, channeling that into my work, channeling that into more caregiving. How do I show up for these animals? How do I, to a certain extent, use these animals in this amazing job that I have to distract myself from the icky feelings that I might have to sit with outside of work? So that's where kind of the blend between animal training and the beginning of the exposure to grief and loss and change came from.
Yeah, and I will add to that too. I think you obviously brought up several good points, but where we are developmentally ourselves, I think for a young person coming out of college into this kind of space, you could be in your early 20s. You're still developmentally not all the way done yet. There's different stages our brains go through for development and maturing, and a lot of times we have to deal with grief early on in our career because, like you said, you come into work and you might already have geriatric animals that have been there much longer than, some of your coworkers maybe. So that's a great point too. And then also the idea of, if you've only experienced grief in the animal care world versus losing a family member, or if you only lost a family member, then you go into work and you lose an animal. It is different, but the grief process is similar. But I think each experience of grief hits differently. And I'm just speaking from my own experience, but I do believe there is sort of a lesson in each loss, and not to say like, oh, look for the bright side, but I'm speaking from my own experience. I learned so much about myself going through a career of losing animals I worked with, just because, like you had pointed out at the beginning, we live a lot longer than many of the species we work with. Where you first join the team, you're working with older animals. So there was that process for me at the beginning. And then when I lost a family member, I went into that knowing, okay, I remember how it goes, but it hits so differently, and there was lessons there. And then I went through a process of losing other things in my life on the tailcoats or close to that. And each grief cycle had familiar steps, but each one was unique to the relationship of what I was grieving. And that was those were the lessons I learned in that process. So I'd be fascinated to hear from you in your experience now moving forward. You're doing the dolphin training, you're experiencing some loss and grief there. Were those the things that opened the door for you to look more into becoming a coach for a grief process, or were there other things that came into play? You mentioned your father, of course.
Yeah, I love that you brought up this idea of familiarity, and yet each grief experience being very distinct and very unique.
Yeah.
I actually, I say that I retired from the animal training world in 2019, and I transitioned into the corporate world. One thing that I didn't understand when I left the animal world was that I was actually experiencing a lot of burnout. Mm-hmm. I had worked my way up into a senior trainer position. I was then responsible for every human and every animal's safety in my area. I did not understand the weight that I was feeling, in addition to when an animal gets sick, when an animal passes away, you feel that extra burden of responsibility when you're in a leadership position. And something that I realized not until I got into the corporate world and I started getting formal training on leadership, that I was experiencing burnout. And this was in 2019. This was before the COVID pandemic happened, when the phrases like burnout and mental health kind of became a part of the lexicon. But I was in my corporate job, and 11 years after my dad passed away, I got the call that my younger brother had died. And this is what I mean about the familiarity, in that I understood, okay, we're doing this grief thing yet again. It feels like we almost go through countless iterations of grief throughout our life. But this was another very significant loss in my personal life. And I did not have any animals that I was caring for other than my own pets, to almost distract me. But what I did learn is all of the work that I had done in the previous years in terms of putting tools in my tool belt for mitigating burnout, those exact tools were also serving me so well in this new round of grief. So I came to this second very significant loss with a different understanding of not necessarily what grief was, because like you said, it's different depending on the relationship, the situation, the stage that you are in life. But I came with an understanding of what would be required of me to get through this. And that doesn't mean that it gets any easier to do those things.
No.
And there's a huge difference between knowing intellectually what you should do versus actually having the energy and the motivation to do those things. Right. But I feel very fortunate in that I had been given so many years between one significant loss, the loss of my father, and another very significant loss, the loss of my brother, to kind of grow and develop more into who I was, but also, like I said, putting those tools in my tool belt that was helping me get through this next wave of grief.
Right, right. And I'll add on to that too, for anyone listening, that some of this may seem familiar, yet not, depending upon what you've been through or are going through. There's also grief when you sometimes change jobs. There's grief when you're laid off, or your department changes, or you're put onto a different team, or a massive relationship change. There's also grief around those things, which is something I also learned in the process of recognizing all these series of losses outside of the animal side of things. And so with that ability to have those tools that you had mentioned, and perhaps recognizing certain things you were going through as an individual with your brother's loss, was that the stage then when you started looking more into understanding grief and realized you wanted to be a person to help others through this process?
Yes. So I actually started coaching in 2023, and I was very focused on burnout. You know, a lot of people say in the coaching world, like, you are your first client. And
Right.
So when I had these tools and I was like, oh my gosh, these are helping me so much. Like, everybody needs to know about this. And then as it does, grief comes in and it's like a tornado, just like kind of whips you around. Sometimes I use the metaphor of like the Marvel comic universe. Like, when a grief event happens, you are skyrocketed into a completely different timeline. And the portal has closed, there's no going back, and you are now in this new world, and you have to figure out how to live in it.
That's a great metaphor, really, because you're right. I think I know for me, part of the initial massive grief process when it came to losing a family member that I didn't experience when losing an animal was that realization that you're on a new timeline now. This is forever different. Your life is forever different. Not to downplay the loss of an animal you're working with, because sure, that changes your routine, that changes your experience at work, but also, at least for me, and again, I can only speak for me on this, is it did feel like, for the first time, a massive shift in my personal timeline. So that analogy is perfect. Portal closes. You're now on this timeline. There's no going back.
Yeah. Well, and my favorite definition of grief is that grief is the natural and normal response to change. And that is any change. A lot of times, losses, because they feel so acute, that kind of overtakes what we think about grief. But grief comes with any type of change, even positive change. You know, if you are a new parent, you are overcome with joy for this new child in your life, but you are mourning your past life, your life of spontaneous social outings, a life of a solid 8 hours of sleep. Like, there are things that we always have to release and let go when something new comes in. And I think that is something that really, this is where the animal world served me so greatly, is understanding that I am not separate from those cycles. That the idea of releasing things is something that nature shows us how to do without resistance. A tree does not cling to its leaves. The ocean does not resist the ebb and flow of its tides. And when we pause and we consider that we are a part of these cycles, that's where we can start to develop more of those feelings of gratitude, of appreciation, of resilience, and understanding, hopefully, that the dying and the decaying sets off the composting, which then provides the nourishing for what is going to grow next in our lives. So just like you said, this is not an instance of like everything happens for a reason. Like, please don't ever say that to a grieving person.
Right.
But this is kind of, I think, the essence of what it means to be human, is the meaning making of it. that we get to decide what that purpose can become, like what that can serve, what purpose that can serve, I should say. You know, I have a very good friend who was one of the managers at the Mirage for years and years and years. And she went to every necropsy. And a necropsy is just an autopsy for an animal, for anybody who doesn't know. But she went to every necropsy of every animal because she said, that is the last lesson that an animal has to teach me. And so that was her way of making meaning out of a loss and a change that she couldn't control. And so I think that's a great example of taking something really awful and doing your best to alchemize it to sustain you going forward.
Yeah. And it's interesting too, in our field of animal care and whatnot, how everyone does have their own way to do that. Like the idea of being there for each necropsy for some people would be very off-putting, but I know for a lot of people it is part of that process, the grieving process, and being able to, I don't know, I think the term make sense of it is perhaps not accurate enough, but to maybe find a space in which there can be a conclusion. You know, and I know some people who've dealt with grief of loss of an animal they've cared for a long time by saying goodbye to it before it goes off to the vet hospital, or saying goodbye to it before it does pass away, however it might be, and then not want to be around when it happens. I've had other people I know that are there for every moment to the last breath, or to your point, someone you knew who's, I'm going also to the necropsy. I'm going to be part of this process to the end. It is, to me, that shows how as humans, we each have our own way of processing and dealing with grief. I do, before we get further into the grief conversation, though, I do want to ask, because you've mentioned it a couple of times, is the burnout side of it. So 2 episodes ago, I interviewed somebody that, Mothering Wildlife, Elizabeth Johnson. She has a podcast where it's specifically interviewing moms who work in zoos in one capacity or another, and talking about how the changes that occur in your life affect or don't affect, or how work can affect all that balancing and everything else. And the term work-life balance came up quite a bit, of course, and there's more to that than just the term. But we also touched a little bit on the fact that burnout is right on the horizon, because you're at work giving so much care and attachment and concern for a living creature. You go home, you have that same responsibility until you eventually hopefully get some sleep and you wake up and you start all over again. And there's that constant tug of war between those two worlds that require so much emotional attention. So that is one path to burnout. In your experience and the process you went through and what you now experience too as a coach, can you kind of frame out for people that are listening, what are some of the ways we find ourselves in burnout?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think we hear the term burnout a lot. Some people identify with it, some people don't. I think that burnout will eventually come for us all when we overextend our capacities. And our capacities will vary at different times in our lives. You know, a mother who is also a zookeeper, probably some limited capacities in certain areas, and bigger capacities in others. Everyone comes to this from different places and they move at different paces, and that is okay. What I think is at the root of all of this is life as we know it, I would argue, is very unnatural from our common state of being as humans for, the past many, many eons. I think that we live in a world now that asks us to always be producing, to always be consistent in our producing, if not, continuing to grow more and more and more. And that's where burnout arrives, is when we think that we can treat the human body as a machine, as something that just has continuous output. But if we think about how human beings have lived for many, many centuries, like even, pre-industrial revolution, but like I'm talking the very beginning of human history. We lived in small social groups. We got up in the morning. We went out for a few hours. We did our hunter-gatherer thing. And then we came back and we just chilled and we hung out. Maybe we got creative and built a tool or made some art, spent some time with, other people in our group forming social connections. And that is just not the reality of how we live anymore. And so when burnout arrives, it usually means that we have depleted all resources across the board. And recovering from burnout, the World Health Organization defines burnout as occupational in nature. So the one side of the coin is, how do we get organizations to understand what burnout is and how to prevent it in the first place. But that's one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is us individually knowing ourselves, knowing what we need, and constructing or trying to carve out time enough to give ourselves what we need. So that's that's where grief re-enters. Grief requires us to just sit with it.
Yeah.
And be with it and understand it. And let me tell you, that is not how the world is designed. The world is designed to show you the next shiny thing, the next 90-second video, the next thing you can buy. We have a lot of distractions, and we seek out those distractions rather than sitting with the uncomfortable feelings.
Yeah, I love this quote I came across a year or two ago. I don't remember for sure. It was Tyler Perry, and I think he was talking to Oprah, and he was talking about his experience with grief and how grief was just sitting right there. And he's like, I'm too busy to deal with that. I've got this to do. I've got that to do. And he's going on. And I'm paraphrasing, of course. And he's like, and grief's like, okay, I'll wait. You keep yourself busy. I'm going to wait. And eventually you won't be busy. And okay. And that's exactly true. To what you said, I want to jump back real quick about knowing ourselves well enough to know what that overextension looks like, knowing ourselves well enough to know when we need to just dial it down a bit and give ourselves the ability and space and time to recover from whatever it is we're overextending. And that can be hard because our culture is so aggressive about that. Do all the things, do it. 4 hours of sleep is enough, all this stuff. So knowing ourselves well enough and then making the appropriate and applicable changes so we can recover to prevent burnout. We're also a very reactive society where we're not going to take measurements or steps to heal until we hit burnout. And then it's like, oh, I went too far. What should I do? Instead of being preventative up front and never hitting it, it's, okay, I've crashed out. Now what do I do? But then, so there's that. But then also what you said about grief in the sense that our world does somehow reward that overly extended, busy attitude. And so when grief shows up, like Tyler Perry had mentioned, it waits. It waits for those quiet moments when you're trying to fall asleep because you spent the entire evening interfacing with a screen or keeping yourself occupied or working 12 hours a day, and you never just sat quietly and let grief introduce itself to you and exploit your emotions for a little bit and allow you to come to terms with what's happened. And I have found that it's happened with me. And to go back to earlier in our conversation, a lot of times when working in animal care, you have so many other animals you're caring for. One passes away, your job still exists. I myself, like others in the field, have gone from having to say goodbye to a best friend at work animal to then turn around 10 minutes later and have to do a presentation in front of kids to get them excited about wildlife conservation. And there's no space in there for you to actually honor what just happened until you get home and you get your evening routine. You got to take care of the kids, you make dinner, whatever. And then all of a sudden you're laying in bed crying your eyes out. And you're like, this doesn't make sense. I don't understand. This is stupid. But it's not stupid. It's just that grief finally had a moment to go, okay, so this is what's going on.
Exactly.
I think there is, to your point also, how you've mentioned it, there is a lot of overlapping between the burnout and grief experience. I think grief is harder to sit with and harder to invite into your life. And I believe that's important, that you do actually have a conscious thought about inviting grief to sit with you and sit with it when you're living in this world that is on the virtue of burnout. And, or even if you are in burnout and you crash, if there's grief in your life at all, it may or may not show up appropriately. Because if you're already emotionally and mentally taxed, grief in and of itself taxes your mental and emotional state. And so if you're already overextended, it can be that much more impactful and challenging to deal with. I want to ask, for you now, having these realizations, having this experience, and now yourself getting into coaching and helping those through grief, it's obviously not just those in the animal world you work with. For you personally in your journey, even though you did experience the loss of your father, 11 years later, your brother, obviously experienced animals passing away. As you stepped into the role now, you mentioned as a coach, you're your first client. As you go through the process of helping others, are you also continually learning more about the process as you coach and work with others?
Oh, absolutely. Well, and that's one of the things that we've talked about before is grief is so unique. And it shows up in so many different ways for so many of us. And a big part of the grief work is A, the allowing, and B, the permission giving. The permission to let it be what it is. You know, I think we try so hard as humans to control everything around us, and we have more of a perception of control than is actual. And nothing shows you that you don't have control faster than grief and loss. And so,
it's so true.
It is. You think that your life is going to go a certain way, and then, change comes in and says, actually, no. And then you have to reorient everything. And so I'm constantly learning new ways of coping. One of the things I do is I facilitate a group for survivors of suicide loss, because my father did end up taking his own life, and that's a very unique kind of grief. And so being in those group spaces, so much of the shame that a lot of people feel, shame dies when it's spoken. And the hearing of the me too is so, gratifying is not the right word. It feels like a weight gets lifted off of you when someone understands, maybe not your exact experience, but where you're coming from or what you're feeling. And so I think because we don't talk about grief enough, we hold it inside and it gets stuck, it gets stagnant. Just like Tyler Perry said, if you don't do grief, grief will do you. And so I also want to recognize that the ability to sit with grief comes with an immense amount of privilege. A lot of us don't have that ability, especially, as a new animal trainer. When my dad passed away, I did not have enough PTO to take off and go home. The average amount of bereavement time in the United States is 3 to 5 days. You are still in shock. You are still numb. You are still in survival mode 3 to 5 days after a major loss. And then you're expected to just jump back in, go back to work, just like you were talking about, go talk to the kids. 2 months after I lost my dad, I returned to work. I was very lucky in that my curator gifted me some of his PTO so that I could go home and not miss a paycheck. But again, that comes from a place of privilege. Not everybody has the opportunity to do that. When I did come back 2 months after my dad passed away, my favorite dolphin, my very first dolphin, the first one I ever formed a relationship with, the first one I ever did programs with, got in the water with, we came in one morning and she was gone. And so we had to put her on the truck, take her to the vet lab, and then I was putting a pouch on, putting a smile on my face, and inviting people into the water because, that's, again, like you said, there's always another demand of us. And nobody wants to be sad when they meet a dolphin. So it is my responsibility to make sure that they have a great time. And I remember being obviously really sad about having lost my first animal. And this is, you mentioned a little bit about culture at the very beginning of this conversation. I remember my supervisor at the time coming up to me and saying, you might want to check yourself because there are a lot of people on this team that worked with this animal for much longer than you did. And that was a very formative moment for me. And I carried that idea of comparative suffering with me for many, many years. And it wasn't until I moved facilities and I went to a facility here in San Diego that had just same thing, like a huge animal population, but also some older animals. And we had an icon. Her name was Bubbles. She was a pilot whale. She was over 50 years old. I was there the day that we lost Bubbles, and I was the late shift. So I had nothing to do but just like hang out and wait for, all of the things that have to happen after an animal passes away. And one of my senior trainers came in on her day off. She's one of those people who wants to be there for a necropsy, to be able to see the animal and say goodbye. So she came in on her day off and she sat next to me and she said, "How are you doing?" And I said, "I'm okay. I'm sad, but you know what? Like, obviously you've known her for so much longer." And she stopped me. She said, "I'm gonna stop you right there. Don't ever let anyone else tell you what an animal means to you." And when I tell you that was such a gift, that permission to love that animal, that person, that whatever, as much as I wanted to love it and allow that grief to be validated, that was something that I take with me going forward to this day. I will never know what a loss means to someone else. I can only know what my losses mean to me, and I can use that as a way to step into empathy and show up for other people in their losses. But everyone is going to need different things, and everyone is going to approach it in a different way. And we have a saying in the groups that I facilitate, which is, as long as you are not harming yourself or harming others, you are not doing it wrong. There is no right way to do grief other than letting it be what it is and figuring it out as you go and letting that be okay.
I really like that. And I appreciate you sharing that story, because if there's anybody listening who is getting into the animal field or is in it currently, in whatever version, whether it's aquatics, aquarium, zoos, conservation, I really hope that story you just shared opens up people's minds and hearts to the fact that nobody gets to tell anybody what a living entity meant to them. No one gets to tell anybody how they can grieve. And with the, of course, little side caveat rule, no hurting yourself and no hurting others. But to that end, I think we do experience that in many levels where we expect, I shouldn't have this level of emotions. I only knew this animal for 6 months or a year, where these other people knew it since it was born.
Or even different types of animals. Like,
right.
I'm sad about this cockroach.
It's just a lizard, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, it's not like it was, polar bear. Yeah, absolutely. Because grief isn't about, and please help me out here if I'm wrong, but for me, in my experiences, grief isn't about the subject in the sense of what passed or what changed. Grief is about the feelings you had in that space of that thing existing and being there, and then it's taken away, or then it's gone. And so you now have to make that adjustment. And there's a lot of emotions around that. We hear people in our culture talk about the stages of grief, and that involves anger and acceptance and sadness and denial. And there's no perfect linear experience to that. And each experience with each thing that goes away can be different. And for each of us, in our own experiences we've had through life, can dictate how we sit with and manage and work around and live with grief, versus yours and mine might be very different about the same topic, let's say, right? And so I can't say to you, or you can't say to me, or shouldn't, that one of us is doing it wrong. But that takes me then to also want to go back. Earlier, you had mentioned, when you're talking about the groups you work with, specifically losing a family member to suicide, in that you were talking about this weight is sort of lifted from being heard and seen by others. Whether you're understood or not is not always the case, but at least there's this sort of moment that there are other people on this planet right now that understand to a certain degree what I'm going through. And it is a unique situation each time, whether you're dealing with betrayal trauma, whether you're dealing with divorce, whether you're dealing with loss of job, loss of a family member, and then how did that family member go? A family member passing away from perhaps a disease you knew had a timeline attached to it is a different experience for someone who loses somebody in an accident versus someone who's lost a loved one to taking their own life. And it's not that one is more or less than the other. And same when it comes to lizard or polar bear. Mm-hmm. It is that it's just going to be unique for the individual's experience. And I think that should be respected. And I love the fact, too, in your story that you had somebody at a higher level of supervisor or manager that said, I'm going to gift you some PTO. That person understood the assignment. That person understood that our culture does not allow for enough room for us to properly deal with things like grief. And so I think that's really a wonderful gift and a great example for how I think more of us should approach being in existence with those going through things.
Yeah. And grief is the one thing that we all have in common. Like, that is the thing that will come for us all. Right?
Exactly.
Show me anyone who has not lost something in their lives. Like, I don't think that that's possible. I mean, maybe if you're like a narcissist and you don't care about anything, but like anybody who cares about something and loses it, like you understand grief to a certain extent. And that is one thing that I do tell people as often as I can is whatever is within your capacity to take that time. If that means that you only get 3 to 5 days, take all of it. If that means that you're lucky enough to take a longer leave of absence, please do so. If that means that you, at the end of the day, set a timer for 10 minutes and just shut the door and give yourself 10 minutes, please take that time, because that is the only thing that will allow us the space to start to process and integrate and understand what this new normal looks like for us. And you did mention the 5 stages of grief. I'm here to debunk that. Sorry.
Oh, good. No, go for it. Yes.
So the 5 stages.
I agree. I don't think that is completely accurate, but it's always tossed around as something that how grief works. I'm like, well, it's not a cycle exactly. It's not linear. It doesn't. But yes, please go for it.
The 5 stages.
Do the thing.
Yeah. We're going to debunk it. So the 5 stages of grief was research done back in the 70s, and it was specifically done on cancer patients who had just gotten a terminal diagnosis. So it was specifically for people who were reckoning with this one instance and their, inevitable ending. I mean, it's inevitable for all of us, right? But this very like the timeline was very short.
Yeah.
So, and these 5 stages just kind of got swept up into the culture and the lexicon. And even the researchers were like, it doesn't apply to everyone. But society loves like 5 things that you do, or like, here's the 3 tips. Like, we love when things are packaged very neatly. And I think it helps us feel like we, again, have that sense of control of like, okay, well, here's how I'm going to do grief. I'm going to do phase 1, then phase 2, 3, 4, 5, and then I'm going to be done with it. And that's not how it works. You're never done with grief. Like, something really common is for people to go through the first year of grief. And, that's where you hit every milestone, like the first holiday without something, the first anniversary without something, the first birthday, whatever it may be. You hit all of these first milestones and you hit the year mark and you're like, oh, great, I did it. I'm done. We're going to check that box. And then truthfully, like the second year comes and smacks you upside the head because you are not bracing for it like you are those first milestones. And so like I said, I hate to burst everyone's bubble, but grief is a very non-linear process. And it's, like I said, it's different for everyone. And it's really about knowing yourself enough to know what grief looks like for you.
Yeah. And with that too, I would like to add, I remember reading, and going through the processes and trying to understand and sit with and let myself understand grief more when I was going through some things. I remember reading, and again, I can't remember the exact way it was written, but essentially what I took away from it was that when grief happens, so in my case, my dad passing away, at that moment, you are picking up a weight that you've never had to carry before. And we expect eventually we'll get to put that weight down. And this person was saying that essentially you don't ever put the weight down, just like going to the gym and working out in a workout routine you've never done before. The first time you do it, it's really, really hard. But as time goes forward, if you stay consistent with it, it suddenly becomes easy and you can add more resistance and you can add more to the routine and you start building and your body makes adjustments. And then eventually you can add more to that. And they were saying grief is basically like you were picking up that weight you've never picked up before, and it's really hard and awkward and heavy. But as time moves forward, it doesn't necessarily get easier so much as you learn how to live your life while carrying that weight, that you make the adjustments to shift something over in your life to make room for the fact that you're carrying this weight also. And I think there was even like this analogy, like you're carrying groceries and the weight and you've got to open your front door. And so before just the groceries and you reach in and get your keys, but now you've got to make sure you can adjust and juggle. And it's not impossible. And eventually you get to the point where you can do these things without even thinking about it, but the grief is always going to be there. And I also agree with and love that you mentioned that the first year anniversaries versus the second year anniversaries and that process is that, again, it's not that the weight or the grief isn't there. It's that it hits differently each time. And eventually you're like, oh, yep, there it is. I recognize you. And for me, I personally have, when I see it and feel it and recognize that it's, oh, you're here. Okay. Hello, grief. I can actually recognize it and just accept, okay, so this is it. And I know it's a privilege for many of us to be able to do that because it's not something a lot of people can. You had mentioned also in the process of, sit down for 10 minutes and make that space for it. I would also like to add to that, if you can, when you do feel it coming on, if you can take a little break from whatever it is you're doing and just sit with it. And if it's a guttural, ugly cry, then do it. And I'll share a little personal story. After my dad passed away, we were going through some of his clothing that obviously, no one in the family was going to take it. And so we decided it would be a donation. And, we had some tears around some things and I'm like, I'll take it, and it was just this weird sensation taking some of his personal belongings to be donated, knowing though that someone else would be able to benefit from it was very nice. And I knew that would what he would want. went through the process of delivering it, donating it, got in the car, pulled out of the parking lot, went around the corner, and then I just had to let it go. So I pulled over, and it was one of those things where it's like I could have tried to have sucked it up probably and made it back to the family house. But I recognize no, this needs to happen now. And so I would encourage people too, if you're in a space where you can make that choice, to give yourself that 5 minutes to 10 minutes to ugly cry, do it. If you can't, obviously you can't, like we mentioned earlier, sometimes nope, put on the bait belt and, get my next animal out and do a presentation where I'm smiling. It's obviously a little bit different in every situation, but there is such great value in making room for grief, especially when it's initially really showing itself. And I hope anybody listening, again, whether it's animal world or otherwise, can apply that. Or if someone who works for you is going through grief, you can apply that knowledge to what they might be needing too.
Yeah. And that's something that, everybody will have their own way of communicating what's going on. But I do encourage people, if you feel safe enough to do so, if someone has earned the right to hear your story, to share what you're going through. Because, if no one knows that you're experiencing a loss and you go excuse yourself and go to the walk-in freezer for 10 minutes, they're like, where's Brigid? Oh my God, we're not. But then if you're like, hey, I need a minute, and then you go to the walk-in, then someone knows okay, I know what Brigid's going through. She's told me that she's taking a minute. I'm going to allow her that because, I have the context that's needed. Right. And not everyone's able to do that. It depends on how supportive your employer is. It oftentimes depends on how supportive your family members are. But if you have that opportunity to share a little bit of context of what you're going through, you will be surprised the number of people who want to support you and help you in any way that they can.
I'm going to interrupt right here just real quick to let you know we're breaking this into 2 parts. This conversation is very good and deserves its full attention. To edit it down to fit into one little episode would be doing a disservice to the topic. So we're going to break it into 2 parts. Don't worry though, part 2 comes out tomorrow morning, very first thing. So it'll be there for you. If you haven't already, make sure you hit subscribe or follow so you don't miss that part 2 and all the other interviews that are coming up the rest of this year. Every Thursday, we have these great interviews that come out, and every Tuesday, 10-minute Tuesdays, shorter solo episodes highlighting a topic that came up the week before or something that's topical in current events. Either way, you got to make sure you hit follow or subscribe. And if you have been following and already are subscribed, well, thank you. I appreciate that. I'm going to wrap this up, though. We've gone long enough. Again, check out tomorrow for part 2. And if for any reason anything mentioned so far in the episode is of interest to you, there are links down below, even in part 1, even though we haven't wrapped this all up yet. Also, you can find my website, zoologyrick.com, along with my social media and other ways to get in touch with me. All right. Have a good one, everybody.